3 years ago, Jacob and I became husband and wife. At the beginning of our marriage, he was incredibly attentive, spending more and more time with me every day, literally spoiling me. I felt like a queen surrounded by love and attention. He gave me flowers, surprised me with unexpected surprises, and often arranged romantic dinners. It seemed that over the years, he tried to do everything he could to make me feel happy. But then, things changed. One evening, coming home, I noticed that he had left his journal on the kitchen table. It was so unlike him. Jacob was usually neat, his personal belongings always in their proper places. I hadn't planned on reading it, but for some reason at that moment I was curious about what was behind his courtesy and care. The diary was open. I picked it up and began to read. Word by word, page by page, my heart clenched. These were not the confessions I had expected. Jacob, my husband, the one who had told me so often how important I was to him, was frankly expressing his contempt for me in his journal. He wrote that my prosthetic leg disgusted him. He complained about how his desire for me fades as soon as he thinks of it. What normal man would marry a crippled woman? Those words were written with such cruelty that I felt the ground go from under my feet. I tried to believe that this was just a consequence of his experiences, that it couldn't be true. But as I read another page, I realized that he was increasingly regretting marrying me. He even wrote that he didn't know how to get me to divorce him. I closed the diary. My hands trembled. It was like being struck by lightning. The feeling that the ground was going out from under my feet, that everything I'd believed had turned out to be a lie. I could feel the bitterness filling me, but I couldn't bring myself to believe what was happening. The Jacob I knew was too good to be like the one I had read about, but maybe this moment was the point of no return. As I put the journal down on the table, I noticed another piece of paper lying next to it. It was a divorce document. My eyes couldn't believe what I saw. I didn't realize what to do. It was hard to realize that the man I considered my rock was wishing for my demise, wishing for me to leave. But I couldn't let myself break down. I stood up quickly, grabbed the paper, and walked out of the house. Jacob didn't even notice me leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. I could hear Jacob coming home, his footsteps down the empty hallways, his footsteps trying to open the bedroom door. He was calling for me. His voice strained, like something was wrong. I sat in the kitchen, huddled on the table, clutching the very papers, nervously. He didn't know that I knew, and I didn't know what to do with what I'd learned. Our whole life, all 3 years of marriage, seemed fake in an instant, like an illusion I'd managed to see through. After a while, I heard him come to the door. He was calling for me. His voice was steady, but I could hear him holding back anxiety. I couldn't answer for fear of giving myself away. I didn't want him to notice that I understood. And then I quickly hid the paper and put the journal in my desk drawer as if nothing had happened. My heart was churning, but outwardly I stayed calm, like everything was fine. Jacob walked into the bedroom and stopped when he saw me. He froze for a second, watching me try to hide my anxiety, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was something strange, like he'd noticed something but didn't know how to deal with it. His face was closed. He walked over to me and I felt his hands on my body. He gently touched my shoulders and whispered, "Are you okay? You're not worried about your leg, are you?" I didn't answer. That moment when I couldn't be sincere, when I got scared. 3 years ago, in a terrible accident, I lost my leg. That moment had been my curse and my salvation, but the pain that came with each rain was unbearable. But this time the tears weren't because of that. My tears were because of what I realized. I had never been loved for him. He was there for me because of guilt. He picked me up in his arms and carried me into the bedroom. There was nothing I could do. The light touch of his hands seemed too cold for me at that moment. He was trying. But was this man who I thought he was? I stared at his face, trying to figure out if this was really love. When Jacob gently removed my prosthesis and began to massage my leg, I felt his touch become more and more gentle. He seemed to be teaching himself to do it right. His movements were deliberate, confident, almost caring. I noticed how he watched my reactions carefully, knowing that every wrong move would hurt me. He was sincere, and in that moment his soft touches felt like caring, but not in the way I expected them to. In his eyes I saw concern, but also determination. He clearly didn't want me to suffer, and yet it was hard for me to believe that this man who cared for me so genuinely was the same Jacob who'd written in his journal a couple days ago that he wanted a divorce. But his caring hands couldn't be a lie right now. They couldn't be connected to the words I'd read. "If it hurts next time, call me," he said quietly, his gaze soft. "I'll always be there to help. Don't suffer alone." My eyes lowered involuntarily. I stared at his face, trying to see if he was hiding something. There was something unusual about his features, something achingly beautiful, but I still couldn't shake the thought of that journal. In his warm words, I tried to find the truth. Was it the truth or just a mask? When he was done and I was already lying in bed with my eyes closed, I tried to focus on his words. He returned to the conversation, starting to joke like he always did, but there was anxiety in my heart. It couldn't be that there was only a mask between us. He couldn't be so affectionate and yet so cruel in his thoughts. After all, if he truly loved me, he wouldn't have written what I had read. I tried to stifle my inner questions and looked up at him when he suddenly turned to me with a slight smile. "What's on your mind there, Claire? Is everything okay?" His voice was soft, but there was a slight worry in it. "You're not worried, are you? I'm just looking out for you. You're my wife." Then I couldn't hold back any longer. My inner struggle had reached a climax, and I couldn't stay calm. I sighed and said with restraint, but with deep inner pain, "Jacob, do you love me? Have you ever loved me?" He froze a little, his eyes evasive, and I could see him trying to answer. For a few seconds that seemed like an eternity to me. He was silent, and in that moment I realized that his answer didn't matter to me. Words didn't matter. He leaned toward me and said with sadness in his voice, I don't know. It's all complicated." He quickly changed the subject without waiting for me to continue. The topic of love had become something unnecessary, as if I'd asked a question that had no answer. It was so painful that I could barely hold back the tears, and I realized I couldn't go on like this. All this time. I was just an obligation to him, some duty that had to be fulfilled. When he went into the kitchen to make dinner, I was alone in the bedroom. My thoughts were confused. 3 years we'd been together, and I'd believed so strongly in his love. But what now? When I looked in the mirror, I saw my reflected smile that seemed empty. I had lived those 3 years as if in some kind of dream, but now everything was clear. I couldn't fool myself anymore. His words, his actions, all indicated that I wasn't the love of his life, but just part of a bad decision. And yet, despite this, something deep inside me continued to hope, even though it seemed absurd to me. I remembered how it all started 3 years ago. I never planned to save him. That day, as he stood in front of the car, he was a stranger to me. But without thinking, I stepped in his direction. And now here I was, with a man who couldn't accept me for who I was. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space beside me, and suddenly I felt so lonely that I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I whispered softly but desperately, "Jacob, if I had known that all this time you didn't love me, I wouldn't have forced you to stay. You could have left, and I would have let you go." I woke up the next morning with a strange feeling that something was wrong. Jacob had already left for work, and I stayed home, not knowing what to do with myself. Thoughts of the journal, of his words, began to haunt me again. My leg, which often caused me pain, felt heavier and stiffer than ever. I could hardly move, but every movement reminded me how dependent I had become, not only on his care, but on his silent contempt, and it was unbearable. I sat at the kitchen table, immersed in my thoughts. Everything was jumbled in. My head, his words from his diary, his tenderness and his coldness at the same time. I tried to figure out what was really going on between us. Was it all just my trauma? Or was I really the woman he was living with out of duty, not love? At that moment, I heard his car pull into the yard. My heart raced, and I quickly got out of my seat, trying to straighten up. I didn't want him to see me in pain. I was afraid that if he saw me like this, he'd start trying to make excuses again, and I didn't need that. I couldn't afford to be weak. I looked up when he walked into the house. He was in his usual good mood, but I noticed something strange in his eyes. It was like he was unsure of himself. He walked over to me and said quietly, almost inaudibly, "Claire, you're not yourself today. What's wrong? You're not worried, are you?" His voice was quiet but not sincere. I sensed that he was trying to be restrained, but he couldn't hide some anxiety. Maybe he was afraid I'd found out his secret. Maybe he was afraid I'd realize that everything he did was only under duress. In that second, I wanted to tell him everything, but I held back. I couldn't be the woman who lived by someone else's rules anymore. I just looked at him and smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. I said, "It's okay, Jacob. Sometimes it's just too complicated." He nodded, but I noticed his face get a little tense. I knew he would expect me to explain, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't talk about how I felt. I couldn't open up because there was some kind of barrier inside of me, something that was built on deception, on guilt, on fear of losing each other. I couldn't let myself destroy everything we had built, but I couldn't continue to live in this world of lies either. That evening, as we sat at dinner, I noticed how Jacob kept trying to talk to me, but his words wouldn't reach me. I could see him looking at me, trying to figure out what I was really thinking. We sat across from each other, and in that moment there was no spark between us, no words that could restore the rapport we had before. His caring seemed like a duty now. He cared for me because he had to, not because he wanted to. I could no longer hide the fact that something had broken between us. "Don't you want to talk?" he asked, his voice becoming a little insistent. I didn't answer right away. I was thinking. I didn't want to ruin the fragile world he and I had built, but it was too painful to go on living without knowing what would happen next. I lowered my gaze and said, almost in a whisper, "Jacob, did you ever love me?" He was silent, his hand frozen over the fork. He knew it was a question that couldn't be answered simply, but I needed to hear his answer, even though I already knew he wouldn't be honest. He looked up, seemingly trying to find something in my gaze that would give him time to think. I don't know," he finally answered, but his words didn't seem sincere. "I love you, Claire. You know that." He said it, but I felt like the words didn't touch my soul. I was hurt, but I knew I couldn't go on living in that emptiness. I had already realized that his feelings for me were not driven by love, but by guilt. And no matter how much he tried to convince me otherwise, I knew that all this time we weren't living a real life. 3 days later, I made a decision that felt necessary. I couldn't continue living in this house, in this city, surrounded by lies and half measures. I couldn't stay close to the man who had once been everything to me, but was now a stranger. I knew that at some point he had to realize that we couldn't go on, that it wasn't just my disability that was keeping us apart, but his own feelings, which had long since faded. I sat down at my desk and, without any confidence in my actions, wrote the divorce papers. I could feel how hard this was for me, but I realized that I could no longer live in a relationship that was built on guilt rather than love. I looked at the paper, at my signature, and felt the heaviness recede. But at the same time, fear came at the same time. What would happen next? What would Jacob say? Would he realize that this was the only way for me to find myself? I didn't know the answer. There was a knock on the door. I got up and went to open it. Jacob was standing outside the door with flowers, as usual. He was in his usual relaxed state, but his eyes, so calm and confident, suddenly met mine. He obviously noticed something in my gaze, something that made him hesitate. He said with a smile, "I wanted to surprise you. Hi, Claire. Are you okay?" I felt a twinge inside me, as if I was on the verge of exclaiming, "Yes, I'm fine, I'll be fine." But instead, I remained silent. His words seemed so empty to me, just like his concern. He didn't know that I had already made up my mind. I shook my head, trying to hide everything that was going on inside. I couldn't tell him that his kind acts didn't matter anymore, that I needed real love, not pity. "Jacob, I can't go on like this. I need time to process," I said quietly, not daring to look up. His face changed instantly. He hadn't expected that answer. I saw fear appear on his face. He was clearly shocked by what I was saying. He took a slow step toward me, and his face became serious. "Claire, what do you mean? What are you talking about? We've been through so much together. Do you want to end it all? Do you want to leave?" I didn't answer. I just closed my eyes so I wouldn't see his face or hear his words. But in that moment, I felt my heart break. I couldn't leave him, but I couldn't stay either. I knew he wasn't the man I thought he was. He wasn't someone who could love me wholeheartedly. He couldn't love me like I loved him. That was the tragedy of it all. "We both know we can't go on like this," I said, gathering the last of my strength to say the words. "I want a divorce, Jacob. I want to go back to myself, to find myself again." His face paled and panic appeared in his eyes. He couldn't understand why I was so determined. He didn't know that behind it was not only my pain, but the realization that I could no longer live with a man who had never truly loved me. Jacob stood in front of me, his hands nervously clenched into fists and his lips pressed against his teeth. I could see him trying to collect his thoughts, his eyes darting from me to the door and back again. But I knew there was nothing he could do. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. "You can't do this," he cried out, almost begging me. "You don't know what you're saying. This isn't just a divorce, Claire. You're saying you want to leave me, the person who's been there for you all this time, helping you, supporting you. I'm going to lose you." I could feel his words penetrating me, his pleas tearing at my heart. But in that moment, I also realized that despite all of this, I couldn't be there for him. I couldn't continue to live in this hell where his words and his actions didn't match. I couldn't be his responsibility. "You're not losing me, Jacob," I said finally, pulling myself together. "You're setting me free." I turned to the table and picked up the divorce papers. I paused for a moment, but then I made up my mind. I signed them, and my fingers trembled slightly as I signed. After I signed the papers, the atmosphere in the room changed. Jacob stood in front of me, his body clenched and his face contorted with emotion. He was like a trapped recluse, and I could see his inner world crumbling. He couldn't understand what had happened, why I seemed to be giving up everything we had built together. But I could no longer live in this cocoon full of lies and guilt. I couldn't be the woman he complained to out of a sense of obligation. Jacob took a step forward, and his hands reached for me again, as if trying to regain the contact we'd lost. His eyes were full of pain and fear. He still didn't understand what was happening. "Claire, please." His voice was almost pleading. "You can't just ruin everything. We've been through so much. You can't leave me." I felt his words burn me, not because I was afraid of them, but because there was no truth in them. I couldn't hold on to the illusion any longer. I couldn't go on living my life hoping that he would change, that his feelings for me would ever be genuine. "Jacob, I can't go on. I can't keep living in this. We're not the same person we used to be. You don't even love me. You stayed with me out of guilt. That's not living. It's just existence." My words sounded firm, even though my heart was literally bursting with pain. He took a step back, as if he hadn't expected that answer. His face grew even paler, and his gaze darkened. He still couldn't seem to realize that I was ready to leave. All this time, he'd been sure he could have gotten me back, that I was just going through some kind of storm of emotions. But I couldn't pretend anymore. "You don't believe me?" he asked, barely restraining himself. "It wasn't my fault. I was saving you. I couldn't leave you, Claire." I looked at him, unable to hide my despair any longer. He said it again. He said he'd saved me, as if that was what justified his treatment of me. He kept looking at me with an expression that made it clear to me that he didn't see me as a woman who deserved to be loved. He saw only his victim, whom he had supposedly saved, and it was unbearable. "You saved me, yes," I said quietly. "But you didn't save my soul, Jacob. You never loved me. You kept being there because you had to, not because you wanted to. I can't live in that. I deserve more than that." He stopped talking. His eyes filled with despair, but I didn't see regret in them. I saw him trying to understand what had happened, why his words no longer mattered to me. He stood there for a few more seconds, trying to say something, but then, without a word, he turned and left the room. That night, I was alone, in an empty apartment that had once been full of hope and love. Now, in that silence, I felt everything I had loved go away. I couldn't bring back the past. I couldn't turn back time, but I knew I wouldn't wait for him to come back. I wouldn't try to live again for something that was long gone. That was my victory, and my loss at the same time. The next day, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in this town, in this house, among these memories. I bought a train ticket and decided to leave. I had to find a new path, but before I left, I had to finalize everything. I walked over to the desk where the divorce papers were left. I was going to send them to the court. It was the only thing I could do. I wrote a letter and put it in an envelope. It contained everything I couldn't tell Jacob in person. That he was no longer the man I loved, and that I couldn't continue to live in the shadow of his guilt. I let him go in order to let myself go. When I stepped outside, I felt better. With each step, I felt the weight lifted off my shoulders. I knew I wasn't going back. My steps led me to the train station where I boarded the train to start a new life. The only memories left in this city were memories I could no longer carry with me. The path I chose was long and uncharted. As I traveled the miles, I could feel my confidence slowly returning. The town of Gardenside was behind me, and with it all the memories I had carried around for so long. All this time, I had been searching for love, but now I realized that I had to learn to love myself first. Without that, you can't build anything real. I came to a new place, a small town where no one knew me or could judge me based on my past mistakes. It was a liberation. I rented a small apartment, not luxurious, but quite cozy. Soon I began to settle in, exploring the local streets, getting to know my neighbors. Life began to take on a new meaning. I felt like I could breathe again. As the weeks passed, I began to feel stronger, but there was still pain inside, an unremitting wound that I couldn't heal. The day I decided to go out for a walk, the air was fresh and cool. It was just the kind of weather that always brought me relief, especially when I was having a hard time. I took the route I now knew, past the old library, which had a few cafes and stores next to it, and lo and behold, without expecting it, I met him. Christian was standing at a stand of books, as if he had no interest in anything around him. He was familiar to me. Not so long ago, I had seen him at the local hospital where he worked. His warm gaze immediately caught my attention. Our eyes met, and his expression changed immediately. He came up to me with a slight smile and said, "Hi, I didn't expect to see you here." I felt a slight nervousness, but there was nothing alarming in his voice. He was easy to talk to, and his words were as calm as his very essence. He had a kind of magnetism, subtle, but appealing. I noticed his gaze looking at me, but not the usual, evaluating one I'd seen before. I didn't see pity or sympathy in his eyes. He didn't look at me as a victim. "Hello, Christian," I answered, smiling, trying to hide the wave of emotion that came over me. "Yes, I've been here for a while." He nodded, and for a while we just stood there, talking about nothing, like two casual acquaintances. I told him a little about myself, about how I needed time to realize who I really was. He listened attentively, but didn't impose his advice. I noticed how calmly he took my story. I felt lighter in his presence, even though I couldn't figure out what it was about this man that attracted me. It wasn't pity or an attempt to help. It was simple kindness and respect. "You know," Christian said after a moment of silence, "you look like you've come here for a fresh start. This is the right place for that." I nodded. I had the feeling that he understood me, even though we hardly knew each other. I felt something in my chest respond to his words. Being honest with myself and others was what I needed. I didn't need anyone to feel sorry for me. I wanted to be free. We decided to walk together through the city. His steps were sure, his conversations simple, but in them I found some harmony that I was missing. We discussed everything from the latest news to the books we liked to read. We laughed, and I realized that laughter hadn't been in my life for a long time. He didn't try to delve into my problems, he was just there for me. As we walked through Central Park, I felt the slight veil of anxiety begin to lift from my heart. Maybe I could be happy after all. Not right now, not immediately, but somewhere in the future maybe. That evening of the same day, I returned home. My small apartment didn't seem so lonely now. I took off my coat, set my bag on the table, and closed my eyes, absorbed in the memories of today's encounter. Christian was an unusual man. He didn't have the sympathy and pity in his gaze that I was used to seeing in people in Gardenside. He just saw me as an equal. It was something new, and I liked it. I sat down at my desk and started writing in my journal. It was my way of getting my thoughts in order. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I felt like something important was happening. Maybe I didn't need anyone to save me. I could handle myself. I sat at the window for a long time that night, watching the lights of the city reflected in the glass. Dreaming of the future, I decided that this would be my beginning, my real beginning. The next morning when I woke up, the day seemed special. Nothing seemed to have changed, but something inside me was transformed. I didn't know if it was the influence of the city or if it was just a moment where everything from the past mattered less. The weather outside my window was clear, and the sun was streaming through the cold air, filling the room with light. I decided that I needed to get out and explore new possibilities. Everything in this city seemed new, uncharted, and I felt it as a challenge. I didn't have a clear plan, but it felt like I was ready for a change. I had long since stopped being a woman who lived in the past, burdened by memories and mistakes. After breakfast, I went to a local park where I often spent time. Here, amidst the greenery and the morning mist, I felt at peace. This place was unlike anything I knew in Gardenside. I could be myself without hiding. There were no pity-filled stares here, no people trying to understand me through the prism of my weaknesses. Soon, I met a familiar face. It was Christian. He was sitting on a bench, holding a book in his hands. When he saw me, he smiled, and I realized that he, too, felt that we were not just random passers-by in this city. We started talking, and it soon became apparent that we had a lot in common. He had not been in this town as long as I had and was finding his way. We laughed a lot, and I felt something warm blossom in my heart again. Christian was a man who didn't judge me, didn't look at me as weak or unhappy. He saw me simply as a human being, and that was admirable. "What do you think about trying to get a job here?" he suggested at one point, looking at me with genuine interest. "I thought you said you wanted a fresh start. Why not do it right now?" I wondered. Christian was right. I couldn't hide behind my past anymore. I needed to do something to feel alive, to confirm for myself that I could be more than just a woman without a past. I nodded. You're right. I think I should give it a try. Maybe I'll even teach. I've always dreamed of having my own school. He backed me up, and in that moment I felt something inside me shift. That conversation was a turning point for me. I decided that I wanted to work with children, to pass on what I knew to them, and maybe help myself. Christian offered to help me find a place. I knew I needed to leave everything behind and start building my future, and he was willing to support me in that. A few days passed, and with each new morning, I felt my life fill with meaning. I found a place to work. It was a small ballet studio located in the center of town where children could take dance classes. I had dreamed of teaching for a long time, but I kept putting that dream off, thinking it was too hard to achieve. Now here I was, and everything seemed possible. Christian continued to be there for me. He helped me with the organization, and I was glad that I could be needed again, that I could do something. Working with children, teaching, was finally what I was looking for. Here I was not a woman who had lost a leg. I was a teacher, a mentor, a person who could give something. At the end of the week, I walked into the studio for the first time where I met my students. The little ones looked at me with smiles, and I realized that this was exactly the job I had dreamed of. Everything fell into place, and I no longer felt alone. When I came home in the evening, Christian was always waiting for me. He supported me in everything and helped me when I needed advice. But despite his kindness, I still felt that something important remained in the air between us. I couldn't figure out what it was. He didn't impose his feelings, didn't try to speed things up, but I knew something was changing. A few months later, I was getting used to my new life. My studio was popular with the locals, and I felt like I was becoming a part of this town. The morning workouts, the evening classes, the kids I was working with, it all filled me with energy and joy. I realized that this was exactly the life I was looking for. There was no pity or contempt. Everything was honest and real. Every day as I walked through the city, I encountered familiar faces, and it began to bring me comfort. People in the neighborhood began to recognize me not as that woman with the trauma, but as a teacher who could inspire, help, and give something important. My students and their parents became part of my world, and I felt like I was finally finding my home. But sometimes, late at night, when I was alone in my apartment, I still felt loneliness. It wasn't the loneliness I'd felt before when Jacob was around, but rather a space inside of me that felt empty. Even with all the work and people around me, I was missing something, or someone. At times like this, I often thought of Christian. He continued to be there for me, but his presence was not what I expected. It was something different. He didn't impose. He didn't rush things. He was there as a quiet observer, as support, but not as someone trying to get something in return. I couldn't understand exactly how I felt, but everything in his demeanor said that he valued me too. This was a man who didn't demand anything, but didn't leave me alone either. That night, when I got home after class, I saw Christian standing at the door. He came to me with a bouquet of flowers. In his hands were white orchids, flowers that I had always loved, but that I thought were too dainty for ordinary days. "I thought you might want some joy," he said, smiling at me. "You deserve it, don't you?" I felt slightly embarrassed, but at the same time, warmed by his words. He didn't say anything unnecessary, didn't try to make me feel obligated. He was just giving me the joy he felt. I took the bouquet and looked into his eyes, not knowing what to say. I knew I should just say thank you, but his attention made me think. "Thank you, Christian," I said, trying to hide a smile. "You always know how to cheer me up." We sat with him, talking about life, about our surroundings, and about how much had changed since I'd come to this town. I told him how important it was for me to feel needed, how much I appreciated being able to be here, in this place. with these people. He listened to me, didn't interrupt, just supported me. And in that moment, I realized that I'd never felt such a sense of peace and balance. Not from Jacob, but from Christian. He didn't say he loved me. He didn't try to win my heart. He was there as a support, as someone I could share my thoughts with without fear of rejection. In his presence, I felt alive, but at the same time, his silence made me wonder how I felt. What if he was the one person who truly understood me, but never wanted more than to be there for me? I couldn't answer that question for sure, but I felt like things weren't going to be the same. I was no longer the woman who lived in the past. I was ready to move forward, but where that path would take me, I didn't know. That night, after Christian left, I was alone with a bouquet of orchids in my hands. I thought about how things had changed over the past few months. I was becoming more confident every day, but at the same time, I felt like there was a lot that remained unsaid. I wanted to move forward, but I couldn't quite figure out exactly what was in store for me. I was still doubting myself, still searching for answers to questions I didn't choose to ask. But perhaps I was on my way to those answers. I looked at the orchids on the table. Their white petals were soft and pure, like my new beginnings. I realized that maybe I could be like that too, clean, renewed, ready for whatever was ahead of me. But with each passing day, I felt more and more that my future would not be as I had envisioned it. Christian didn't demand any confessions from me, didn't make me rush into anything. He just was. And that was all that mattered. It made me feel like maybe I could trust and open up again. I realized that I didn't have to be afraid to take steps forward. And maybe in the future, wherever I am, I will be ready for a new life. Without fear, without regrets, just finding my way. The weeks flew by quickly, and I began to realize how much my life had changed. Working in the studio, socializing with children, making new acquaintances, all this brought me joy. But I felt more and more that my life was missing something important, and that something was a man beside whom I could feel like not just a woman who had overcome pain, but a woman who was trustworthy and with whom I could build something real. Christian continued to be there for me, but he was as invisible to me as he had been before. We spent time together, seeing each other often, talking, but somehow everything stayed on the surface. He never talked about how he felt, and I didn't want to rush him. But I felt in my heart that this man was the one who could help me find the answers to the questions I was asking myself. One evening, coming home after work, I saw him in my driveway. He was standing leaning against a pole, saying something quietly on the phone. His calmness drew me in, as always, but this time I noticed him looking at me intently, noticing me coming back. It wasn't just a look. It was the look of a man who had wanted to say something for a long time, but hadn't dared. When he finished talking, he walked over to me, and I felt something inside me tremble. He didn't look like a man who was only supportive. He was more than that, and I knew there was something lurking in his gaze that I hadn't noticed before. "Hi, Claire," he said with a slight smile. "You look tired." I looked at him and nodded, but my mind was on something else. In that moment, I realized that Christian was the kind of person who could be a part of my world, but I didn't know if I was ready to let someone back into my life. "I'm really tired," I replied, trying to smile, "but I feel like I'm starting to find my way." He tilted his head slightly as if trying to figure out what I meant. His eyes were so clear and open, I wanted to share with him everything I was feeling, but I couldn't yet. I wasn't ready to trust completely. This was too important. "I like the way you've changed," he said. "You're more confident, but something tells me you still haven't fully opened up." His words made me think. I was indeed changing, but I was still closed in my shell, not allowing anyone to penetrate beyond that layer. I was afraid that if I opened myself up, I would lose myself again. "I'm not ready to reveal everything yet," I said, holding my gaze. but I feel like I'm getting closer." He looked at me silently, not trying to press, not demanding a confession. There was so much understanding in his silence that it made me feel better. He didn't rush me. He was just there for me, and that was what mattered. "I'm here when you're ready," Christian said quietly. "No rush. Just be yourself." I stood next to him and felt trust begin to grow in my heart. Maybe Christian was the right person to help me understand what it meant to be truly happy, but I still wasn't sure if I was ready to open my heart again. We walked together to my apartment in silence, and I realized that today had been another step in finding myself. That night, lying in bed, I thought about what it meant to be free from fear, from pain, from the past. I knew this journey would be a long one, but I no longer felt alone. I began to realize that something big was ahead of me. The next morning, I woke up feeling like my life had meaning again. The time I spent with Christian was a big moment for me. I realized that I was ready to move on, but not because Christian was forcing me to, but because I realized that it was time to let go of the past and start a new life. I wasn't ready to jump into a relationship, but I was ready to start on a new path, and he could possibly be a part of that path. I went to the studio again, but this time I didn't feel empty. I knew that all the changes that were happening in my life were the result of my own choices. I was no longer dependent on other people's opinions, no longer looking for someone else's pity. I was ready to be me, the real me. When I got home, I saw Christian standing in my driveway again. There was something more than just friendly concern in his eyes. He walked up to me and said, "Claire, are you ready to move forward?" I looked him in the eye and replied, "Yes, I am ready." A few weeks went by and I began to feel my efforts starting to pay off. The studio was gaining popularity, the kids were getting better at dancing, and I was beginning to believe that my life had become meaningful. Suddenly, as if on a whim, I felt ready to open up. I was no longer the woman who hid behind a wall of fears and doubts. I realized that I could be happy no matter who was around me. Christian continued to be there for me, but had found his own way in this city, just as I had. He was no longer just a support for me. With each passing day, he became something important that I could lose. He didn't rush, he didn't push, but his presence was felt, so quiet and invisible that I didn't need words to know he was important. He was someone who was there for me and who didn't demand love or acceptance from me. One evening, when I came home again after work, I felt that moment was important. He was at the door with a cup of coffee in his hands and an easy smile that felt cozy and familiar. "Hi," he said. "How are you?" "I'm fine," I answered, though inside I could feel the urge to share everything that had been building up. "I had a good day today." "I'm glad you're doing so well." He looked at me as if he could see everything I was going through without saying a word, and I felt like I could trust him. We went to my apartment, and I motioned for him to sit down. We didn't talk much because everything was already said in our attitudes and actions. But that night, something changed. I couldn't understand what it was, but I had a feeling that I was on the verge of something new. It had nothing to do with Christian, but it had to do with the fact that I was finally starting to believe in myself. We talked about how the city had changed, how people were changing, and how I myself had changed. I told him about my plans for the future, about how I wanted to keep developing and not stop there. Christian listened, and there was no judgment or pity in his gaze, only understanding. "You know, Claire," he said after a pause, "I always knew you would find your way. You're strong." Those words were like a breeze caressing my face. I couldn't believe that once upon a time, sitting in Gardenside, I couldn't imagine being so sure of my choices. "You're strong too," I replied, though there was something new in my words. There was gratitude in my voice, not only for him being there for me, but for letting me be me. He didn't bother to say more, just sat next to me, as if he knew I needed that silence. I felt something grow between us that required no explanation. It was just being there for each other. Every day I felt better. I didn't know where my path would be, but I was confident that I was moving in the right direction. That night, sitting with Christian, I realized that many of the questions I had asked myself before were no longer relevant. I stopped being afraid of what was ahead of me because I realized that what was most important was being honest with myself. Christian soon stood up and looked at me and said, "I'm glad you say that, Claire. You deserve the happiness you're looking for." I just nodded because I finally realized that I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I wasn't looking for a savior. I wasn't looking for love's sake. I was looking for myself, and I knew now that I had found what I was looking for. It may have been the beginning of something new, but I was no longer afraid to go down that path. When Christian left, I was left alone in the silence. But that silence was no longer a frightening silence. It was a silence where I could be myself, without fear or regret. I could move forward. I lay in bed and thought about how much I'd been through, how much more was yet to come. I didn't know what would happen next, but I no longer felt empty. I felt like I was finding my path, and maybe that path would lead me to something greater than I could ever imagine. A few days after that conversation with Christian, I felt like I was really starting to rebuild my life. In my work, in my interactions with my kids, in my new acquaintances, it all filled me with joy. I didn't expect to adapt so quickly, but I think I succeeded. Every day brought new experiences, and I no longer felt a weight on my shoulders. But the more I immersed myself in my new life, the more I realized that I didn't want to be alone anymore. My thoughts kept returning to Christian. He wasn't someone who forced his feelings on me or demanded anything of me, but there was something about him that made me think about the future. One day, I received an unexpected invitation. It was a meeting organized by the local cultural center. They decided to hold an evening for people who are active in the life of the city, support cultural initiatives, and develop something new. I was a bit surprised, but decided that it was a good opportunity to get to know the city even better. When I arrived at the event, I noticed that many familiar faces were there, people I had socialized with, children of my students, and a few acquaintances I had met in the city. In the corner of the hall, I saw Christian. He had come too, though he didn't seem to intend to linger. He was standing at the window, looking out at the city, absorbed in his thoughts. I didn't approach him right away. My gaze met his, and I saw something new in his eyes, something that made me feel my heart race. He smiled at me, and I walked over to him. "You're here too?" I asked, smiling. "Yes," he answered. I thought it was worth supporting this initiative. And to be honest, I was glad to see you. They were simple words, but they made me feel warmer. We started talking, but his ease and unobtrusiveness left no doubt. Christian was a man with whom you could talk about anything without fear of being judged or underestimated. "You look wonderful, Claire," he said after a while. "You've really done a lot lately. You've built something of your own." I looked at him, and in that moment, I felt something in our friendship begin to change. It wasn't a longing for a relationship. It was something deeper and more important. He looked at me with respect, and I, in turn, began to respect him for letting me be me. "Thank you," I replied, "but it wasn't just me. I learned a lot, and you were there for me, too." In that simple conversation, I felt new horizons opening up. He was there for me, and his presence was important to me. It wasn't a direct confession, but it felt like something more than just friendship was being built between us. "Do you want to go for a walk?" he suggested as the evening drew to a close. "I know a place here that has a beautiful view of the city." I agreed, and we went outside. The evening was cool, but that didn't stop me from feeling comfortable around him. We walked in silence, enjoying each other's company. When we reached a spot, he stopped and pointed at the horizon. "See? This is the corner where I often reflect. It's always so peaceful here." I stood beside him, looking out at the evening city. It wasn't just beautiful to me. It was a symbol of everything I had experienced and was experiencing. Here, in this moment, I felt like everything was finally falling into place. "You're right," I said, smiling a little. "It really is peaceful here." He turned to me and looked into my eyes and said, "I'm glad you're here, Claire. You deserve it." His words were quiet, but there was so much sincerity in them that I felt everything inside me tremble. In that moment, I realized that I didn't need to look for love. It was already there. And maybe with Christian I could build something real, but only if I was willing to open my heart. The day after our walk, I felt strange. It was some new feeling that I couldn't immediately understand. There was something important in his words, but I couldn't decide what it was. Maybe I just needed to let time do its thing. Christian and I continued to communicate, and while everything was in place, deep down I knew I needed to be careful. Time passed, and I continued my work in the studio, assuring myself more and more that this new path for me was the right one. Christian was there for me, and his presence became more and more important to me, but at the same time, I realized that I wasn't ready to jump into a relationship yet. I had to make this journey on my own, and maybe sometime in the future, things would change. Time passed, and I felt my life becoming more and more harmonious. Working in the studio, I discovered new talents in myself that I had not even noticed before. My students were getting better, and I was proud of their success, because it was not only their achievement but mine as well. I felt that I could be a true mentor, a person who makes an impact on the lives of others. Every day, I was more and more confident in the path I had chosen. There was no fear or doubt. There was clarity in my heart. But I also knew that I was not alone on this path. Christian stayed by my side, and even though our relationship didn't turn romantic, I was at ease with him. He was someone I could share my thoughts with without fear of being misunderstood. He was just a friend, but in his eyes, I sometimes saw more than that. One day, on my way home after work, I met him in my driveway. He was holding the same bouquet again, the white orchids he had given me the first time. He stood there waiting for me to approach, and when I did, he said softly, "I can't be quiet anymore, Claire." I felt my heart quicken its rhythm, but I tried to stay calm. Christian never rushed things, but something in his tone was different now. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to hide my excitement. He handed me the flowers, and as I accepted them, his gaze became more serious. "I don't just want to be your friend, Claire," he said quietly but firmly. "I want to be with you. I feel like you're my person." It was unexpected. I didn't know what to say. There was no pressure or expectation in his words. He was just saying what he felt, and it was sincere. I looked at him, and in that moment, something inside me changed. I had been searching for this moment for a long time, a moment when I could open my heart again, and here it was. "I feel it too, Christian," I answered, gathering my thoughts. "But I need time to figure out what I want out of life and relationships. You're right, you're important to me, but I can't throw myself into it right away." He nodded, realizing I wasn't ready to rush things, but there was tolerance in his eyes, and I realized we were on the same path. He didn't demand immediate solutions. He was just there for me, and that was important. "I'll wait, Claire, and if you're ready, I'll be here," he said. There was no fear in his words, no doubt. It was the certainty I'd been looking for so long. I felt like all I needed was to be real, and if time showed that we were right for each other, I would be ready to move forward. Months went by, and life continued to unfold in front of me like a new page of a book. I wasn't looking for the easy way out, and everything I had gained was well-deserved. My heart was no longer closed. I learned to love myself and appreciate what I had. I had more and more students in my studio, and every day I felt like this was where I belonged. I became a part of this city, a part of the people that surrounded me, and I was proud of that. With Christian, we continued to be there for each other, taking things slow. He supported me every step of the way, and his presence became natural to me. We weren't a couple in the accepted sense, but there was something more to our relationship that couldn't be explained in words. We were two people who understood each other without too many words. I stood at the window of my apartment, looking out at the evening city, and felt it become home to me. It was a new stage, a new turn in my life. I wasn't looking for the perfect partner. I was looking for me, and I found it. There was no need for the past, no fear, no regrets. I was ready to move forward. And maybe someday, if the timing is right, I will be ready for something more than I ever imagined. Fate, like life, doesn't always give answers right away, but sometimes it gives you a chance. And that chance was mine. I smiled, sighing quietly. Everything was in place.